Welcome back to our series on important Galicians of the past 2 centuries, and today we speak once more about a very important Zionist of the time. Recall that Zionism is something that evolves out of the Haskalah, and that Galicia was one of its leading centers, both in raw numbers and in terms of leadership of the global movement, which was based, after all, in Vienna, the capital of the Austrian Empire. Zionism drew on 2 distinct groups: disillusioned integrationists, those who had grown up, integrated and acculturated, but encountered anti-Semitism and feeling rejected, become drawn to Zionism, like Theodor Herzl; and modernizing ethnicists, those who come out of a Jewish background, seek a modern identity that draws on an authentic Jewish feeling, but in a secular modern milieu. Among the latter group, the modernizing ethnicists, one of the most important and accomplished Zionist leaders was Yehoshua Thon, rabbi, educator, philosopher, sociologist, writer, journalist, preacher, and political leader, one of the most important Jews of those decades, whom you probably never heard of. Born in Lvov, Lemberg, to which he remained attached his entire life, as you see on the screen. Lvov, he wrote, is my homeland. In the city I was born, and there are the roots and origins of my soul. From my forefathers I am a Lvover and will always be a Lvover. He was raised desperately poor, receives a traditional education, earning Orthodox ordination, rabbinic ordination at age 16. But secretly was fascinated with the Haskalah. He joins Mikra Kodesh society as a teenager, quickly rising as one of its important leaders, along with Marcus Braudy and Mordechai Ehrenpreis, both featured with him as teenagers in that photo. They also, by the way, will later enjoy spectacular careers as modern rabbis, and also joined by more assimilated Jews like Adolf Stand, whom we heard about earlier. Started by integrationists, Mikra Kodesh evolves into the first Zionist club in Galicia, renamed Zion in 1888. This is a decade before Herzl arrives on the scene. The 3 friends saw Zionism not as a long-term solution in Palestine, but as an immediate solution to the need for a new Jewish identity, one that integrated Judaism and politics and modernity. Galicia at the time was a swamp of ideas, with young people jumping in and out of radically different clubs and ideas and ideologies: Zionist to socialist, assimilationist to Zionist, liberal to Orthodox, and back again. These 3 settled early in Zionism, and there they stayed. In Berlin, wrote Thon's daughter years later, the fate of the 3 friends was the same. We 3 shall be the first to create a new type of rabbi, and we 3 shall be princes of the spiritual aristocracy. My father, she wrote, thought that in the first place it was necessary to obtain a general science and a Jewish knowledge as a first-class weapon against all the attacks and all arguments on the Jewish national ideas. The new modern Zionist rabbi would be not just a spiritual leader, but a political one, using his pulpit to preach the revolution of the contemporary generation. They saw Zionism and the rabbinate as a middle way between European culture and traditional or Orthodox, in any event, Judaism. From 1891 to 95, Thon was studying philosophy at the University of Berlin, where he earned his doctorate with a dissertation on Kant's moral philosophy, still living with his childhood friends, Ehrenpreis and Braudy. It was the same exposure to European culture for all 3, replacing Zion from Lemberg with a new local group, Young Israel. In 1897, he graduated from the Berlin Reform Rabbinical School, the so-called Institute for the Scientific Study of Judaism, after being threatened with expulsion for propagating Zionism, and then landed at the Progressive Synagogue in Krakow, where he also taught Judaism in the city's public secondary schools. He took on the training to lead Galician Jewry into the 20th century. That was his self-appointed mission. The postulate, wrote his daughter, that a rabbi cannot have a political opinion of a definite party was false. The moment has already come that the synagogue stops being the synagogue as of old. The preacher will not be the same as before. All this will not be any more God's memorial only. It will rather be a place to preach the revolution of the contemporary generation. Although it's worth noting, I have to say before moving on, that new letters discovered from Thon reveal he might have actually preferred an academic track of a professor had that been an option at the time. He was also active in local B'nai B'rith humanitarian association, which he turned towards Zionism. So beloved was he in Krakow that his overwhelmingly anti-Zionist constituency, including leaders of the integrationist liberal movement, permitted him to promote Zionism in his sermons, which he did every week, as long as he distanced himself from active Zionist politics, a condition he respected at least until 1907. He bridged East and West, fluent in Polish, a demand of his job, but sensitive to the needs of traditional Jews, whom he wanted to expose to modern ideas as committed Jews. A Renaissance man, at home in many fields, philosophy, sociology, literature, theology, and history, dedicated to Hebrew language and culture, which he loved, but also never abandoning Yiddish, which he also loved. Nor did he leave the Zionist movement during those 10 years, between 97 and 1907. On the contrary, he developed contact with both Herzl, the political Zionist, and Achad Ha'am, the leader of cultural Zionism. And it was he, Thon, who pushed Herzl to launch a party paper, Die Welt, and he helped organize the first Zionist Congress, which unfortunately he couldn't attend because of his work. Today's Zionist generation, he wrote, cannot grasp the concept of the enormous impression which that book, Der Judenstaat, then made on us, the activists who stood in the middle of Zionist activity. It was for us a sharp word of agreement, encouragement, and empowerment, which came to us from some great height, perhaps from the most heavenly heights. Herzl taught Galician Zionists, he wrote, to think in millions, suggesting, quote, a plan of such scope and of such daring that I became dizzy. He was the head of the executive committee at the Second Zionist Congress, although he left upset at Herzl's disrespecting cultural Zionism, the same complaint that Achad Ha'am had. Following the demands of his job, he left politics for a decade until joining the massive Zionist effort to elect members of parliament across Galicia and Vienna in 1907, when parliamentary elections adopted universal manhood suffrage. He co-founded and then led the new Diaspora Jewish Nationalist Organization and personally ran for office in Kolomea, although he was defeated because of electoral chicanery. This work on that organization, on those campaigns, cost his friend Brody his job as preacher in Stanislav, but Thon was so beloved as a rabbi and preacher that his anti-Zionist constituents wouldn't cut him. And it was reciprocal, by the way. He loved Jews, and when his Zionist colleague, Adolf Stand, celebrated the defeat of an assimilationist Jew in the 1901 provincial election, Thon slammed him publicly. Horowitz, the man's name, ran as a Jew, Thon wrote, and his Jewish opponent ran only as a Democrat. He was actually ambiguous about those activities in 07, despite organizing the campaigns, despite running himself. In the aftermath, he wasn't sure it was worth it. He wrote that the Zionist contribution to Jewish politicization came at the expense of the movement itself, which might have used those resources to gain new members. And yet he remains committed to that project. He served as a member of the Jewish delegation to the Paris Peace Conference after World War I, and most importantly, from 1919 to 1935, he sat on the Polish parliament as a member of the Jewish caucus, which he headed from 1930 to 35. When Polish Jews argued and debated the best way to protect Jewish rights in that anti-Semitic state, none of which proved successful, he was in favor of the 1924 Ugoda, or pact, with other national minorities to pressure the Polish government to protect their rights. This reflects his Galician background. Galician Zionists have a history of working with other national minorities like the Ukrainians to try to protect their rights. He remained a member of the Executive Committee and the Powerful Actions Committee of the World Zionist Organization from 1923, as well as countless other Zionist bodies, including co-founding in 1918 Nowy Dziennik, the first Polish-language Zionist daily. He also helps establish the Institute for Judaic Studies in Warsaw. And all the while, this incredibly charismatic speaker and leader wrote literally thousands of articles in Hebrew, Yiddish, German, Polish, and English on philosophy, literature, art, homilies, and of course, politics. After losing his seat in 1935, he spent his remaining months writing on Zionism and his memoirs. His passing on November 11th, 1936, was mourned across countless Jewish periodicals, and his funeral attended by some 30,000 people. Eulogies poured in, not dissimilar to this tribute published even before his passing by the Zionist leader Nahum Sokolov. You are loved by the people, and you have the talent to unite people. In the Polish parliament, you defend the Jewish and the general country interests in a respectable way. Also, before you entered politics, you fought on the one hand against seclusion in the ghetto, and on the other hand against assimilation. You are a real Zionist, courageous, idealist, who is highly ethical, a person who never betrays his principles, who has a great sensitivity for any discrimination, and therefore so many appreciate you so much. He was at least spared witnessing or experiencing the destruction that was about to come, a refutation perhaps of his optimism that he retained until the end. And yet his careful balance of Zionism as a form of religious Jewish identity, together with active engagement in modern culture and domestic politics, is arguably the most relevant approach for millions of Jews now living in diaspora, especially America. Thus, his biography is not only incredibly impressive and an example of Galician leadership in world Jewry, it remains inspirational and prescient for today. Thank you very much.